through question-answer sessions. So we can't ignore that China has definitely played a great role in shaping Indo-American relationships. There is shared concern both these countries, rather many other countries in the world have, because of a very typical Chinese behavior, sir. Its economic behavior, its policy of unilateral declarations and then unilateral changing positions. All these things have been so uncomfortable, especially to Indo and India and America, that China won't be an exaggeration to say that China has impacted Indo-American relationships and will probably keep on impacting, keeping in view the pro-Pakistan stance it has and the recent military escalations we have seen on the borders. So India also recognizes, or I think it must recognize, that single-handedly, despite having acquired a lot of economic power, a lot of military power, it definitely can't single-handedly either control the malignant behavior of America, nor it can of China, nor it can hold China accountable for such malignant behavior, and it will always need some international support. And China and America comes to acquire a very important position and way for India to build its relationship, to keep China under check, if I'm using the proper words. So there have been concerns when this change of power took place, that the type of personal diplomacy our Prime Minister Modi had with Trump, will it affect Indo-American relationships? But then, sir, there was a viewpoint. Biden as Vice President has visited India. Our Prime Minister Modi and Biden, they have organized personal dinners. He had been a member of Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, and then these couple of decisions he took immediately after taking over as president, joining Paris Accord, rejoining Paris Accord, UNESCO, WHO. Actually, they all go to indicate that Biden is a traditional policy maker, a traditional diplomacy, and if it is true, then the relationships the Prime Minister Modi might have enjoyed with Trump at personal level are definitely not going to affect Indo-US relations in any manner, sir. But in any case, sir, with you here, probably we'll be much more enlightened. And I'm very happy that I'm also a part of this talk, sir. And with these words, sir, I request you to kindly, Madam Dhar, can I invite Professor Menon, sir, directly? Or
yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, kindly, sir. We are eagerly awaiting his speech. Yes, sir.
We are eagerly awaiting to listen, sir. And not only we, sir, we are a strong community of around 200 teachers. Our students are also joining online. And in addition to students and faculty of our university, there are many from other universities also. So welcome, sir, and thank you for blessing us with your virtual presence. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Rakesh Kumar Sharma. It's really good of you. Professor Rajdhar, for all those actually far too good a welcome, actually, an introduction. Now, that's almost impossible to live up to. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me to GEU and to speak to you about the India-China relations in the Biden era, which we have just entered this year. I couldn't resist coming and talking to you, even though it's virtual, because I've heard very good things about the university. And also the topic is very interesting. It's very topical. What I thought I'd do was to speak for about 10 minutes on India-China relations, how we got here, and how the Republic of India, the People's Republic of China, managed the relationship, and the US factor in India-China relations, and then a little bit about what we might expect. And thereafter, I'd like to throw it open to questions, to a discussion with all of you. India-China relations have always been complex. And I think, we've been, traditionally, there are sort of two narratives which have been fed to us. One is this rosy picture of India and China, great friends through history, Buddhism, pilgrims, Xuanzang, never went to war, had a great relationship, etc. This was actually a very useful narrative for the national movement in India and for Chinese, as Chinese nationalism was being built in the late 19th, early 20th century in response to the impact of the West, Western imperialism, basically. And in both countries, it was part of the creation of their own sense of self, their own identity, the reassertion of their own civilizational greatness, their own past, and giving themselves value, which after when the West came, in our case, when the British came and colonized us, when there was a problem naturally of low self-esteem, the same in the Chinese. In fact, in the Chinese case, they now call it the century of humiliation. So this was a narrative which both national movements and the Chinese also promoted right through the 19th, early 20th century. But frankly, there is another narrative, which is here were two closed societies right through history, who maybe, yes, a few pilgrims came and went and religion spread along with trade, but basically they didn't have much to do with each other. They were very ingrown. This was a narrative which, by the way, the West fed us. They liked to make you think that you were insular, that you were closed, that you were divided, polarized, that you were never united, that your history was divided by religious periods, that you had a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and then the modern period when the British came. And they tell you this myth, in India certainly, because it helped them to rule, that you are not only divided, but you've never been united until the British came. This great lie. Whereas if you look at history, both India and China have been open polities, open societies, trading with the rest of the world. Until 1750, both India and China together accounted for something like 2/3 of world GDP. India accounted for 1/3 of world manufactures in 1750. Angus Maddison has the figures. You can look at his website. I mean, they've been working on this for years. And it's an interesting, actually, how we have today swallowed these versions of our past history. Now, the truth between India and China is somewhere in the middle. The fact is, we had a lot to do with each other. We traded, we exchanged ideas, we exchanged pilgrims. Buddhism did spread from India to China through Central Asia and Southeast Asia. And we did influence each other in various ways. If you look at the number of words with the prefix or suffix China in Sanskrit, most of these are things that either came from China, China patta, silk, and the same thing in China. You can tell which words are attached to objects or technologies that came from India. And there's a huge number of them. But we never were involved in each other's political or security calculus. Our politics was our own. These were multiverses. Chinese politics, whether it was one or several or many polities in the space that is now called China, or in India, the same thing. The Chinese were not part of that calculus in India, and Indians were not part of that calculus in China. So, as I said, the truth is between these two stories that we are told. But the result of that was twofold, and this is really the point. Why is the past important? Because when India became independent in 1947, and within a few years, 1st of October, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China. The Communist Revolution took over China. And as Mao Zedong said, China has stood up. When both these two new states were formed, strongly nationalist in reaction, post-colonial states, in reaction to the imperial era, which was now finally over, they had no real experience of dealing with each other. There had been very little direct dealing, either political or, as I said, we hadn't been part of each other's security calculus at all. Now, you can say this is an advantage. We were writing on blank slate. We could choose what to do. But we came with very different inheritances from the colonial past. We had different traditional worldviews, and not only did we not have anything to do with each other's security or political calculus, but we also came with different colonial experiences. When I say we had different traditional worldviews, what I mean is if you look at Kautilya, Arthashastra, at our whole tradition, for them the world is a multipolar place. In Kautilya there are kingdoms, there are republics, there are confederations, there are city-states, there are empires, and you deal with all of them within this multi-state system. Your neighbor's neighbor is your friend, which means you're already talking about a three-state problem. For the Chinese, it was one universe. It was one heaven, one son of heaven, who was the emperor of everything. He was universal emperor. And everybody below that on earth owed him loyalty. And the Chinese had a very Sinocentric, unified, simplified view of the world. The rest of the world owed them tribute. They called the system the tributary system. Our traditional thought saw the world in terms which, frankly, you can recognize today's world. Multiple states, different capacities, some are stronger, some are weaker, and they maneuver among themselves trying to get their national interests done. And we both chose to deal with the world differently, whether it's the People's Republic of China or the Republic of India. We got independent, the Chinese formed the PRC in a Cold War world, when the world was divided between two superpowers, a binary world between the US and the Soviet Union. And we chose to deal with it very differently, both internally and externally. Externally, we chose non-alignment. We refused to choose sides. Both sides said, join us. We said, no. We said we would follow our own interests. We would not be entangled into other people's alliances, where once you're part of the alliance decides when you fight, when you don't fight, what you do, what stand you take. We said, no, we haven't fought for our independence just to hand it over to an alliance or to somebody else. And that was actually a very brave choice. Don't forget the condition of India at independence. Well, life expectancy was around 26 years, about 14% literacy, 8% among women. I mean, famine, you name it, death, partition had just seen 10 million refugees. These are not small numbers. So when you look at our condition, 200 years of colonialism had reduced one of the world's most advanced and prosperous countries to one of its most backward and really one of the most miserable in terms of the living of its people. And so despite all that, we decided to stand on our own and follow non-alignment. The Chinese chose the opposite. They chose to ally. First thing they did, Mao Zedong went to Moscow, his first and one of the only two trips he made abroad. He made another trip to Moscow in 1957. And within a month of declaring the People's Republic of China, he was off to Moscow. He met Stalin, signed a treaty of friendship, defense, alliance with the Soviet Union, and followed a policy, as Mao himself called it, of lean to one side. He had chosen his side. Within a year or so, he was already in a war in Korea with the Americans, relying heavily on the Soviets. And the Soviets actually transferred over the next 10 years to Russia in terms of assistance, technology, more than the entire US aid to the rest of the world through the Cold War. So it's really quite amazing So Mao's tactic to develop his own country was to lean to one side, externally, become part of the socialist bloc, of the Soviet bloc, and then to undergo very radical internal reform, whether it was wiping out the landlords. Almost 3 million people were killed in just the first year itself of land reform, and finally by communizing agriculture, by making all agricultural property, including tools, everything, communal property, abolishing private property in the villages. We chose a path of standing on our own externally, but reforming internally. We too did land reform, but we did most of it voluntarily, by persuasion, by legal means, without the sort of bloodshed and force that China used to do it. And there's a big difference in the revolutionary path that Mao Zedong chose, in fact, of permanent revolution in his words, and the reforming changes that we adopted both internally and externally. And as a result, you could see diverging trajectories. Both governments tried initially, because the last thing they wanted was trouble with a neighbor, to manage the relationship, but they weren't very successful in the 50s for three reasons. One, Tibet. In 1950, China occupied Tibet. And for the first time in history, we had an actual border with China. Before that, we had a boundary with Tibet, which had been settled in custom, treaty for large parts, and which both sides respected. The people on both sides knew where the boundary was. There wasn't really a problem. The PLA came into Tibet in 1950, occupied it, and then the Chinese started trying slowly to change the boundary. First, cartographically, secondly, physically, as they gained capacity in Tibet. And we raised it with them. We told them there was no problem with the boundary with Tibet, but they, of course, said, no, the central government has never approved this, so this is a disputed boundary. But they hid it. While they changed the facts on the ground, they hid the extent of their claims on Indian territory until 1959, when finally, after several times Nehru had raised it with them, Nehru wrote a letter to Zhou Enlai. In Zhou Enlai's reply, for the first time in January 1959, he revealed the entire scope of how much they claimed, which was 138,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. It's the world's largest boundary dispute. The other reason, of course, is the resistance that they faced in Tibet. By 1956, Tibet was in revolt. When the Dalai Lama came for the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's birth to India in 1956, he spent 6 months here, and at the end he told Nehru that he didn't want to go home because of the situation at home. And of course, Zhou Enlai came running, persuaded him, no, don't worry, we won't touch your autonomy, come home, and so on. By 1959, it was just too much. The Dalai Lama had to flee Tibet, came to India, we gave him sanctuary. Chinese were convinced that India was running a guerrilla war in Tibet and wanted to split Tibet. Mao Zedong was convinced of this. He told the Politburo this, maybe because that is what he would have done in our place. In actual fact, that war was, yes, some of it was supported by the CIA, but not India, through Pakistan, in fact, through what is now Bangladesh, through East Pakistan. And of course, the Tibetans, when the refugees started coming from 56 onwards and floods after 59, of course, we gave them sanctuary, and the Chinese took offense at that, of course. And by 1962, it got to the stage where, frankly, we ended up in a war. We all know the result of that war. The war was actually, by modern military standards, a fairly small-scale affair. But the fact is, we lost the war, and the Chinese then, and on our side, both sides were then separated by the space along the border, which both sides started building infrastructure, started moving up as their capacity came. By the 80s, we were in actual physical contact again on the border, all along the line. And by 1986, we had the first face-off in Sundarungchu, where the Chinese came and sat where we thought was on our side of the line. So we sat within meters of them, and we had actually armed confrontation, which went on for almost 8 years before we actually negotiated the end of it. I mention this because much of what we see today is not new. This business of Chinese coming, sitting where they haven't been before, our going and showing similar force, and then negotiating and then getting out. But the result of 86 was that very soon after that Sundarungchu incident, we declared Arunachal Pradesh as a state, and the Chinese themselves got into internal troubles. Don't forget, they had the Tiananmen killings of the students in the main square in the heart of Peking took place in 1989 and was building up during this period. Tibet was also up in flames in 1987-88. So the Chinese decided that they were also watching the collapse of the Soviet Union at the same time and the resistance, and they were seeing the US winning across the board. So they decided this is not a time to get into more trouble on the borders with India, with the others. In 1988, during the Rajiv Gandhi visit, they agreed to maintain the status quo on the border, keep the peace, and to sign confidence-building agreements and so on, establishing that peace, and not to allow the border and the boundary to affect the rest of the relationship, to start the rest of the relationship. Don't forget, this is at a time when we are roughly equal in terms of the size of the economy, GDP, in terms of our technological levels, and there is a military balance on the border also, which deters anyone from trying to change the situation. That modus vivendi of keeping the peace, keeping the border as it was formalized in a Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 1993. That actually kept the peace for almost 30 years. And that modus live and let live. We both concentrated on other. By 1991 had started radical reform internally, opening up. We had to deal with a post-Cold War world. We had to, Chinese also, which was basically a unipolar world with one superpower, the US. So we concentrated on our relationships with the US, on opening up our economy, developing our own country. And those were the years actually which were the best years for both India and China in terms of growth. The Chinese got about 30 years of 10% growth. We did about 30 years, more than 30 years of almost 7% growth from 1992 onwards. In fact, the high growth years were the first decade of this century for India, because these were also when the world was a globalized world, was opening up. And we did well. And the relationship stayed stable. We didn't solve the issues, but they didn't get worse either, and we didn't, because we had better things to do, quite frankly. But from about 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power, this relationship has been increasingly stressed. And the signs were clear. One, if you look at China's attitude to the rise of India. In 2008, when we went to the Nuclear Supplier Group for an exemption, the Chinese went along with the consensus. They always opposed a permanent seat in the Security Council for India, but that, frankly, they could hide behind other people. But in the NSG, in 2008, they went along with what everybody else said, yes, let's do it. So they gave us an exemption, unique to us, and we can now trade with whoever we want to, whoever wants to trade with us. By 2015, when we applied for membership in the NSG, the Chinese actually opposed it publicly, even before the meeting took place. They let it be known in the People's Daily articles that they were not in favor of this, and they said they needed criteria, they made all kinds of excuses. Basically, they were feeling that much more confident. Secondly, there was a series of escalating incidents on the border. In 2013, the Chinese came into Depsang, which is another flashpoint, by the way, now, since 2020 spring again. And we then sent in troops. There was a face-off, confrontation. Within 2.5 weeks, we got them to go back to restore the status quo ante. In 2014, when Xi Jinping came visiting Prime Minister Modi in September, at the same time, 1,000 troops came into an area called Chumar, also in the western sector, also an area which both sides think is on their side of the line. And didn't withdraw for 2.5 weeks. And the message was clear. The message was that we have the military ability to embarrass you when it suits us. So while we are ready to be publicly friendly and to have good relations with you, but don't forget that we also have the stick. So And by 2017, actually, we ended up in a 72-day confrontation in Doklam with the Chinese on a plateau which the Bhutanese claim. And therefore, as treaty allies of the Bhutanese, we had to step in. We ended up in a face-off. Finally, we negotiated a withdrawal. Both sides, the Chinese and we, withdrew from the face-off point. But then the Chinese, after that, came in and occupied the rest of the plateau. They've built 3 helipads, roads, tarred metal roads, etc., and have permanent constructions on a plateau where they never used to be before, which they used to only patrol twice a year in the past, before 2017. So you saw an escalating series of boundary incidents. Thirdly, China's commitment to Pakistan increased tremendously in this period. In 2015, Xi Jinping, the president of China, visited Pakistan, promised a China-Pakistan economic corridor and committed something like $62 billion to that. Because this corridor runs through Indian territory, which is occupied by Pakistan and Kashmir, this actually represents a Chinese commitment to the Pakistani hold in POK, to keeping that going. And also invested heavily in Gwadar port in Balochistan at the top of the Arabian Sea, which gives them a strategic toehold where not only where the oil comes out of the Persian Gulf, but also in the Arabian Sea, which is so critical to our security. So it actually changed the strategic balance, and the Chinese commitment to Pakistan became that much more. And China started becoming active in the subcontinent's politics, whether it was in Nepal, where she worked very hard to get both communist parties, the UML and the Maoists, together into one Communist Party of Nepal, and is still working very hard to keep them in power, or whether she played favorites in Sri Lankan politics between the Rajapaksas and others, or in other countries where she tried to get involved. So in Myanmar, she's already involved. And when the Rohingya events happened, they offered to be honest brokers and mediate between Bangladesh and Myanmar. So she became much more active, much more, started investing. Her BRI commitments in the subcontinent amount to over $100 billion between 2016 and 2019. In the same period, the total Indian investment in the subcontinent, in our neighbors, is $800 million. That's a huge difference. So suddenly we saw China much more active, and most important, we saw her first military base in Djibouti on the Indian Ocean, and her presence, her naval presence in the Indian Ocean region became much, much more active. She was trying to seek bases or ports in Maldives. She built Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, Kyokpu. She's trying to build in Myanmar. And she has been, therefore, trying to build to actually control the sea space around India as well. And with these accumulating signs of stress, finally in Ladakh in 2020, we ended up in a crisis in India-China relations. The Chinese actually tried to move forward in several areas all along the line, occupying territory. That traditionally has either had both sides patrolling through it or was under our control. In one place, at Pangong, we then took some other territory south, which had been vacant before, and then finally we've negotiated a disengagement. They restored the status quo sort of north of the lake, and south of the lake where we had taken territory, we also restored the status quo, basically. But there are still a whole series of flashpoints in Gogra Hot Springs, Galwan itself, all the way up to Depsang, which is close to Siachen and therefore strategically important. There are other areas where we are still in confrontation. Their forces are still built up on both sides. And we are still in the middle of the crisis, actually. There is still a crisis in India-China relations. Why is there a crisis? Because the balance of power has shifted. When we did the modus vivendi, which worked for about 30 years, in 1988, as I said, we were roughly the same size as economies. Today, the Chinese economy is about 4 times bigger than the Indian economy. In military terms, China has modernized her military by leaps and bounds in the last few years. And she obviously feels that she needs to compensate for her own legitimacy at home, to feed the nationalist sentiment at home, so that when she tried this on the border, unlike in the past when she used to describe these disputes as boundary disputes, as a disputed border, she now describes this as a sovereignty issue, as a defense of China's sovereign territory. There's a difference between the two. As long as it's a dispute, it means you can negotiate. There is give and take to settle it. But once you define it as China's sovereign territory, China is not going to give anything. Then it becomes a sacred duty to defend it. And so we today have a confrontation which is very different from anything we've known before. Where will it go? Clearly, we as India, we need to restore deterrence and the balance on the border. First thing, to prevent the Chinese from being tempted to changing more things. That means self-strengthening. Nobody else is going to do this for us. This we have to do ourselves, and we are undertaking military steps. We are doing military reforms, some very important reforms, jointness, etc., under this government, which is taking us forward. But frankly, the Chinese challenge is more than that. China today, we started doing trade of about $2 billion in 1988. By 2019, that trade was over $93 billion. And the balance had shifted completely against us. $53 billion in their favor was the balance out of that $93 billion. So, and we have become dependent over this period on China in critical sectors, telecommunications, power. About 60% of our power generation equipment is Chinese. Even medicines and pharmaceuticals, which we pride ourselves on, the APIs, the ingredients from which they're made, almost 70% come from China. In fact, more than 70% come from China. Many of our advanced sectors, automobiles for instance, depend on China for automobile parts and so on. Machine tools, again, we're dependent on China. So we will have a difficult job now of trying to reduce our dependence on China because we face the prospect with a tense border, the entire border is live, of a much more adversarial relationship with China. We need, therefore, also to work with other countries who are worried by China's behavior, by China's increasing assertiveness abroad. And if you look at the last 15 years or so, our cooperation in defense, intelligence, security with countries like Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, Singapore has increased by leaps and bounds. These are all countries on China's periphery who are also worried, who have their own disputes with China. And in the last few years, we've revived the Quad, which we had tried in 2007-8, but then Australia had pulled out at that time. And we revived that again in 2017 as relations with China got tougher and as everyone's relations with China got tougher. So I haven't mentioned the US at all in this story. Why? Because frankly, India-China relations have their own dynamic. They are not driven by what the US wants or by the state of US-India relations, US-China relations. But the US is a major factor, and the US factor cannot be ignored, and it works in three different ways. India is a factor in US strategy, and this is not the first time. When the US had difficult relations with China, in fact, antagonistic relations through the 50s and 60s, the US, the Eisenhower administration, second Eisenhower administration from 1957 onwards, and the Kennedy administration, 62, 63, they both were convinced that India was a useful counterweight to China, and the relationship boomed. Eisenhower came, visited, got a huge reception, even bigger than the reception that Trump got. when he came in February last year. So, but that relationship pretty soon declined. So India was a factor in US strategy to China. But that initial promise was declined. Partly, of course, we became a needy partner after the defeat in 1962, and we were still dependent on the US. By the mid-60s, we weren't able to feed ourselves. We were dependent on US grain, actually, grain supplies and so on. But also, we took different stances. As our military needs were met increasingly by the Soviet Union, and the US got involved in the Vietnam War, the relationship soured. And then in 1971, of course, the relationship went completely down the tubes when Kissinger was so busy opening up to China, Kissinger and Nixon, that they opposed what we were trying to do in Bangladesh, helping the refugees. And they were just not willing to see. In fact, you know the Kissinger-Nixon tilt against India. And despite that, Mrs. Indira Gandhi managed to create a new country for the first time after World War II, apart from Israel. And she managed to change the map of Southern Asia, of the subcontinent, in fundamental ways which have worked in our favor. But as that alliance, that tacit China-US alliance from 1971 onwards was built on an anti-Soviet platform, that became actually a very negative factor for India, and therefore a negative factor in India-US relations. But that too has shifted. If you look at US policy since the turn of the century, and certainly under George W. Bush, they were the first US administration who again made it clear that the rise of India is in the US strategic interest. And one big reason for that is precisely the rise of China at the same time, because both India and China rose through the 80s, 90s, and noughts of this century. And for the Americans, the rapidity and the scale on which China rose made them a potential peer competitor for the first time. So clearly, China as a factor in US strategy has worked both positively and negatively for India-US relations. Today, China-US relations are those of strategic competition between the two, because they see the Chinese as the only country which can be a competitor to the US across the globe. They're not yet. Today, economically, they are a global superpower, China. But militarily, they cannot compare with the US still. The US is the only superpower who can intervene militarily anywhere around the globe, all around the globe simultaneously. But the struggle is on. And that relationship, and it doesn't matter whether it is Trump or whether it was Obama who pivoted back to Asia or whether it's Biden, China-US strategic contention is here to stay. They are economically codependent, so therefore it's not a Cold War like the Soviet Union and the US. And there are areas where they will cooperate, whether it is on climate change or whether it is on some of the economic areas where they have a common interest. And at some stage, when they sense any third country also trying to enter their league, they will cooperate against that. But that stage is not now. Today, these two powers are much more powerful than anyone else on earth. And their contention between themselves is going to be the main driver of global politics. So what does that mean for India? Does that mean that, like in the Cold War, when it was bipolar, we could be non-aligned? Can we balance? Can we hedge? Yes and no. Their own relationship is different from the Cold War relationship. As I said, they are codependent, they do communicate, they do work together, they have some common interests. Secondly, our relationship with China and China's reaction to India's rise has been very, very negative. They've tried very hard to get you trapped in the subcontinent, use Pakistan to balance you, and to make sure that you don't get on the global high table in various ways. So given China's reaction, it's not as though you can hedge and manage, theoretically in the world, you should be able to achieve the same distance from both China and the US and then play them off against each other. But that's not how it works. We have a crisis in India-China relations today, and therefore our relationship with the US has got much, much closer, especially in defense and in other fields. But we are not in an alliance situation, and we will not be, because the US, frankly, is not interested in getting into an alliance. There's no alliance on offer to anybody. They don't want to get involved in another Asian land war. Every time they've been involved in one, whether it's Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, it's been disaster from their point of view. So the last thing they want is to be dragged in by a new alliance into an Asian land war, and they will not get involved. So, and for us, frankly, we now can see increasing opportunities created in large part by China's assertive behavior against everybody else. So we can balance China externally, but our primary job has to be to strengthen ourselves, to deal with the challenge from China. And the US is an essential partner in that strengthening of India, in that transformation of India. There's no question. She's still the world's largest economy, accounts for about 26-27% of world GDP, is technologically the most advanced power on earth, still, despite all that you might hear. So, as far as I can see, India-US relations will keep getting stronger, irrespective of India-China relations. Will India-US relations affect India-China relations? Yes, certainly. And the worse China-US relations are, the more Chinese will look with suspicion at what you do with the US. But that's the nature of international politics. Frankly, I mean, there was a stage when the Chinese were junior partners in a virtual alliance with the US, and they benefited greatly. They managed to transform China. Those years of 10% growth were the years when they really worked very, very closely with the US. Let's see where this goes. But today we're at an interesting stage. There is no going back to earlier situations. But we are at an interesting stage. We have to watch China-US relations very carefully. But in the meantime, we need to build our own relationship, not just with the US, but with Japan, with other countries who share our concerns and who have similar interests to us in the neighborhood. I'll stop here, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions and to hear what you think about India-China relations in the Biden era. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It was so wonderful hearing your views, sir. And I have some questions for you, sir. My first question is, sir, to you. Mr. Shashikant, just a second, sir. I am just turning on. Vijay. So the first question I have is from Mr. Shashikant. He's second-year student of JNU. Okay. Sir, he says, the current relation of China and Russia shows its alliance in making, you know, the closeness that is growing between Russia and China. How would this affect India?
Well, it works two ways. One is there's a push factor because the West is applying pressure to Russia, which in a sense has driven her into the Chinese arms, because by expanding the EU to Russian borders, by making Russia's neighbors and former satellites into members of NATO, she has in effect brought military confrontation to China's borders, and China therefore to Russia's borders. And Russia therefore turns east, looks for partners, looks for somebody, and she sees China as a potential partner in that effort. Besides, they have good economic complementarity. Russia is primarily an exporter of energy and raw materials, and China has an insatiable appetite for those to keep her economy going. She has a huge economy, but is an importer of energy and of raw materials across the board. So they have a fit there which works, both a political fit vis-a-vis the West and the US, and an economic fit. But there are limits to this. And not all Russians are very comfortable in this very close embrace with China. Does it affect us? Of course it affects us, because you've seen already that as our relations with China have got worse and our relations with the US have got closer, the Russians get more and more nervous and concerned. And you saw during the Lavrov visit what he said about the Quad, which in effect is a way of commenting on your relationship with the US. So yes, it does affect us. Our own relationship with Russia, frankly, has been steady, long-lasting, has gone through difficult periods before as well. But we've normally managed to overcome them because we do have very similar interests, and Russia has been a reliable partner in several defense and strategic fields. And that's not a relationship that you can turn on and off with a switch whenever it suits you. These are long-term commitments. Once you're running Russian platforms, for instance, you need to maintain, service, upgrade, etc. And these are not things that vanish overnight. So we still have a solid relationship with Russia, but it's going to take hard work in a very different context to work with it. And I don't think we should expect the Russians, they've always found it difficult. Even in 1962, they found it very difficult. They wouldn't choose between you and China. In fact, they swung from one to the other. But they kept telling you, don't worry, we will supply the MiGs to you and the MiG factories to Kanpur, even in the middle of the war. So I don't think we should make people's attitude to China or people's attitude on our difficulties with Pakistan, with China, as a touchstone of our relationship. We should look for what's in our interest in the relationship with Russia. If it serves our interest to buy S-400 from Russia, we should go ahead and do that. And for me, that's the way to approach this problem.
So, second question, I won't bother you much. This is a student asking you, and that is Jyoti Kamboj. She's political science honors 6th semester student. She writes, she's asking you, sir, that once you quoted in your book that, I quote, future generations of Indian diplomats are unlikely to enjoy the freedom of action and choice that cohort with which I trained and worked with, unquote. So the question is, why do you think it was different then and it is different now?
3 reasons. One is everything was new. We were a new state. We were a new service. I mean, this was new to India. I mean, we were all learning as we went along. I mean, look at Nehru himself. He had never been any minister before he became prime minister. And this was true of all of us. It was part of it. So it was new. Secondly, we hadn't got set in our ways. All bureaucracies work on precedent. So when things are new, you still have degrees of freedom. You can actually think things through, decide what to do. You have many more degrees of freedom. And thirdly, even as a bureaucracy, we were very thin on the ground. So we got to do things very early when in our careers, our lives. We got degrees of freedom and authority, which I don't think subsequent generations will have. Now we have a much bigger bureaucratic structure with its rules and its procedures and its systems. Most embassies, for instance, will have 3, 4, 5 officers. When I went to Vienna, there was the ambassador and me, and in 3 years, I had 3 ambassadors because the first 2 retired. And basically, I did all the jobs, including coding the telegrams, doing what. So you learned the job from zero. When we were in Peking the first time in 1976, there was an earthquake. Everybody was sent home, the families and so on. 16 of us lived in tents and ran the embassy, which meant we did everything from cooking to writing political dispatches to going and meeting the Chinese and finding out what was going on and so on, and arguing about Sikkim in those days, actually, about whether Sikkim was part of India or not. So you actually did every job possible, from messenger to cook to driver to whatever. I was interpreter for Ambassador Narayanan, I remember. But at the same time, you did a political job. What now is, you have a whole hierarchy, a structure. So I don't think those levels of freedom they will enjoy. And often when I looked at even much later, 2000s, when I looked at my American or British counterparts, their ambassadors in China and Pakistan, they had much less, A, direct access to their own leadership, B, they had much less freedom in their instructions, because their instructions were very detailed and they really had to follow a script which was written for them at home all the time. And their role in writing that script was, I could see, less than our role, because ours was a much smaller, much more participatory. We all knew each other. You could talk to each other. You could say, no, I think that's a good idea. No, it's a bad idea. Why, And this wasn't misunderstood in MEA. And I hope it still isn't. But that's why I say that we had much higher degrees of freedom at that time.
Would you be taking another question?
Happily. I'll take several. I have no problem.
Thank you. No, you can have your tea also. I know you've been talking continuously. So, this is Dr. Vikas Chaubey. He's a professor in DAV Postgraduate College. And his question is, how should India approach multipolarity developing in the world order? So there is China, there is Russia, there's America, and we have gone from unipolarity to multipolarity. So how does it, what should be India's approach with regard to this?
Let me tell you honestly, I don't think we've gone to multipolarity. I know this is the conventional wisdom. Everybody says we have now multipolar world, etc. I don't think that's happened. If you look at it objectively, yes, the world is multipolar economically, because there are several economic poles. Germany, China, Japan, the US, etc. The US, yes, is still more than 25% of world GDP, but then China is about 18%, and you've got a whole host of other countries. But you look at it militarily. As I said, there's only one global military superpower who can project power across the globe. And the gap between countries in Asia, for instance, is between the US and China are in a league by themselves militarily. But then there's a whole host of other military powers who can complicate their lives. Whether it's Korea, whether it's Japan, whether it's India, whether it's Indonesia, even Singapore, for instance, is a formidable military power. And the result, therefore, is that you cannot say that the world is multipolar militarily. It's confused. Its power is very concentrated in some regions. In some regions, it's not. But the globe is not multipolar militarily still. Nuclear weapons also today are really concentrated in a few hands. There are 8 nuclear weapon states that we know of. And politically, you can see that there is no international political order, multipolar order, which actually works. There's no concert of Europe like there was in the 19th century. There are no structures in Asia. There are no security structures which actually mediate these conflicts and flashpoints, which we now see all across the region, starting from the East China Sea, through Taiwan, through Hong Kong, South China Sea, India-China border, Yemen, you go on, all the way to Ukraine, actually. So it's very, and I'm not even going into Syria, India, all these other flashpoints in places where people are being killed every day. In fact, battlefield deaths today, in the last few years, are back to the highest levels during the Cold War. So this is not a peaceful time that we're living in. And it's not a multipolar world. Secondly, there is an assumption that somehow multipolarity is good for us. I'm not sure how we have arrived at that. If you look at it in terms of India's economy, when did we do best? When did we pull the most people out of poverty? When did we improve our condition in the world and our relative position? We actually did it when the world was unipolar, during the unipolar years after the end of the Cold War and until the global financial crisis of 2008. So I'm not sure that you can make a case for this. There's a fundamental argument in the IR literature about whether multipolarity is stable or unstable, more or less stable than hegemonic systems or bipolar systems, etc. I think for me, bipolar systems by definition are unstable because they will keep struggling to see who comes on top. But multipolar systems, it depends on the balance of power and how stable that is. And that is totally unstable today. If you look at the rate at which relative balance of power is shifting in historical terms, this is very rapid. And this is why there are so many crises, so much instability. So what should India do about it? I think that rather than looking for a structure, for stability, we should be managing change. Change is inevitable. It is changing and it's going to keep changing. It's not going to stop changing now. You saw what COVID did. It accelerated everything. So what do? Manage change, put in place the means to deal with crises, crisis management mechanisms, make sure you have the material power to deal with crises, that you have material power to deter aggression. I mean, there's a whole host of things, but basically you have to change the mindset. It's not that, oh, stable and the multilateral system will take care of us. What multilateral system? You saw what happened in the pandemic. So you need to build your own strength, but you also need to change your mindset in the way you approach it. And don't look for simple theoretical frameworks in this chaotic situation, because my description, we are between orders. And when you're between orders, frankly, you don't know what's going to come out of this. Whether you'll end up in a bipolar system or a hegemonic system or what, we don't know. Let's see.
Question, sir. And that is about a number of students have asked me this question, and academicians also, and that is, what do you think are the main hurdles at present resolving long-lasting conflict between India and China? You know, the border dispute and so many other things.
For me, actually, all these are symptoms. For me, the real problem is our conviction that China is opposed to the rise of India. That China is not happy to see India rise. And the proof of it is in every case when China opposes it, whether it's in the UN Security Council, India's membership of APEC, etc., etc. China was very happy to see us walking out of RCEP, for instance. For me, that is the core problem, because both India and China have risen at different rates, China even faster than India, and both are therefore trying to adjust themselves and the system to themselves, the international system. And unless we can do that in a manner, why does China have so much trouble with the US? Same reason. The US doesn't accept China as an equal. And China feels that now she has risen, now she is so advanced, she has a big economy, she should have a much bigger say in the international system. But the system is still what the US built and ran for so many years. And that will have to be sorted out between them. We have a similar problem among us. Second part of the problem is we both share the same periphery. And therefore, we see the other one's actions in that periphery as threatening. When we see the Chinese active in Nepal, they might think it's defensive because they're trying to defend their interest in Tibet and prevent anything coming back into Tibet threatening their hold. But we see that as China south of the Himalayas in the subcontinent interfering in an area which is critical to our security. And this periphery actually is a big periphery. South China Sea, for instance, 38% of our foreign trade goes through there. So freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is critical to us. But South China Sea is a core interest for the Chinese as well, because that's where all their energy, all their trade, everything passes through there. So, frankly, we need to find a way of adjusting our core interests between ourselves if we want to manage this relationship. And those interests have grown and changed over the last 30 years. We managed them successfully for about 30 years, but over the last 10 years, as I said, since 2012 really, we have been less and less successful in doing that. And what we need is a strategic level understanding. Can we arrive at one? I don't know. It's not easy. In fact, it's got much harder now with very strong authoritarian leaders in both countries relying on nationalism for their legitimacy. So the normal business of give and take, bargaining, and so on becomes much harder. But in this situation, I think it's hard, but it needs to be tried.
Do we, sir, in future see more incidents of Galwan Valley? I mean, if both of them are not going to give an inch, so...
Depends on whether you restore deterrence or not. To some extent you have, because the Chinese didn't have it all their own way last year. But there are other areas where they did. So I think we're still in the middle of it. This is why I'm so nervous to comment or to forecast where we're going, because I think we're still in the middle of a crisis. We're still in the middle of a negotiation. And we will only know after a while whether we have been successful in restoring deterrence on the border and the balance.
So that means my generation will not see any end to this border conflict with China. We'll have to wait and watch.
How long do you plan to live?
Maybe another 20 years, but I don't see any future.
No, I shouldn't ask you these.
Because, you see, those born in the late 50s, they have been witness to quite a lot. We have also been witness to excitation being taken away from us. And infamously, Panditji saying that not a speck of grass grows there. So we have been seeing quite a lot. So we don't know.
From the Chinese. You know, the Chinese have waited 100 years before making their claims, but they never gave them up.
That's true. So, sir, last, I know we are really bothering you a lot. This is a question has been asked by, I think I'm getting the name, and this is your take, personal take. Do you believe the modern hostility between India and China is based on geological, cultural conflicts, or is it purely diversion, political philosophy?
I'll tell you honestly, part of the problem is that we have started thinking like Westerners. We have started thinking like Westphalian states. And if you look at the history of Europe, the moment they became Westphalian states and modern nationalism rose, they spent 400 years fighting wars, ending up with 2 world wars, which destroyed their own power, destroyed Europe's power. I mean, it's 2 wings. Russia and America did very well out of those, but Europe itself. And there is a risk, I think, if we keep looking at the world and dealing with the world in this way, this 19th century European way, which we seem to have swallowed whole. And this is why I keep saying we need to go back to our own strategic traditions, our own ways of thinking and looking at it. But this is a subject for another lecture, I'm afraid. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Mr. Pandit, are you ready for presenting a vote of thanks?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Professor Dar, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead,
Yeah,
sir. Please go ahead.
I'm there. Yeah. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Sure, sir. Let me introduce Mr. Pandit is the alumni of Delhi University, and he's worked many years in Delhi University, and now he's with us since 1 year, and we are learning a lot from his expertise in administrative matters. So, Mr. Pandit, please go ahead. Present a vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Good evening, one and all. As is the norm of concluding an event with vote of thanks, I personally feel privileged to present it today, more so when you have personality like Honorable Shri Shivshankar Menon sir as speaker. The world order has gone tremendous change from bipolarity to unipolar to multipolarity. Even though Menon sir says it is not multipolar, but it is the world where you have different concentration of power at different places and different regions. Recent actions by China in South Asian China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and on our eastern border at Ladakh, and especially in Pengyang Tso and Galwan, the dimension of world order has what China is trying to present seemingly changing. It is trying to project itself as a new power center and to take on the US. While as US, through its actions post Galwan events, has tried to be more aggressive and wants to project as if it will be able to put up everything so that the expansion of China is restricted. Its deployment of naval fleets in the Indian Ocean and Mike Pompeo's open declaration that the Americans will stand with Indians in case there is a military conflict was more of the domestic, what I feel, issue of foreign policy of US to side with India. Now we have different dynamics being played after these incidents as the Russian factor has given up the exclusivity of relation with India a new dimension. The recent visit of Foreign Minister of Russia to Pakistan from India has actually sent a signal to Indian establishment that moving close to Americans is not being appreciated by Moscow. The sale of this Mi-35 military helicopters to Pakistan to counter the terrorism is also not liked by New Delhi. So there are different dynamics which are being observed or which are coming up, emerging out of this Indo-China relation. And ladies and gentlemen, these complex dynamics emerging out have been explained beautifully in a crystallized manner and presented to us in a very lucid manner by Honorable Menon sir. The academicians and researchers of IR generally try to decode the actions of states and their behavior in given circumstances. But Honorable Menon sir has himself been the architect of such actions in Indian context. Sir has explained how chronologically how the rise of China and India, how China moved to NAM, non-aligned movement, while as Chinese moved to Russians, to Moscow. And how our border peace tranquility agreement of 1993 was able to maintain peace for next 30 years between India and China. What Sir tried to hammer out was that it is the India's rise which probably is not being digested by China. And like Americans don't want China to counterbalance them, likewise China is not willing to accept the India's rise, which at international forum came openly in 2008 when India sought exemptions from nuclear supplies group, and when India asked for the membership of NSG in 2013, China firmly opposed it. Even though Honorable Sir brought it out that the world, the economic dependence of India's multi-sectors is heavy on Chinese, and we are linked by our economy with China. But then there are certain areas of cooperation as well as conflict. And China in no case is willing to accept India's rise. Honorable Sir, it was indeed a prized talk for us, an honor for us to host you, sir. I am sure it will help all the students, researchers, and faculty of international relations, more specifically those working in South Asia and Asian Pacific to understand it with a better perspective. We would have felt better privileged had it been a physical meeting. We thank you, sir, for your consent and sharing of knowledge. Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Rakesh Sharma, for attending this webinar. Professor Sharma, in spite of his busy schedule of ensuring that our hosteliers who opted to go home due to the switchover to online classes are taken care, he has attended the webinar today. I must share here that management under the direction of our Honorable President Professor Ganchala arranged special planes on university expenses for students from Dehradun to different parts of country, down to south states like Andhra to northeast Assam. Honorable President believes that students are a vibrant part of our family and we must take utmost care for their safety concerns in this pandemic. Professor Rajdhar, HOD Humanities, and her team, including Dr. Rukmani, Vijay Paul, deserve special thanks for arranging this webinar and more importantly for being able to seek consent from Honorable Shri Shivshankar Menon, sir. I thank all the participants who have registered in large numbers. I am sure they stand benefited today. Though this lecture was through virtual mode, so I am not there to thank caterers, but would pray to Almighty that next time we have such a lecture that should be in a physical form, free of code world, and I include them in my next vote of thanks. Finally, I thank University Technical Team under Akhil Negi for hosting this webinar glitch-free. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and dear participants. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Menon, sir. Indeed a pleasure, sir. Again, would like to have you in person in Dehradun. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Wow.